So it's my pleasure today to introduce Amy Ogan. First, of course, we thank the Glushko Samuelson Foundation and the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts. Amy Ogan got her undergrad and graduate degrees all at Carnegie Mellon, and was an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon in the HCI Institute. She's published widely on human-computer interaction. She's got multiple early and pre-career awards relating to her work. She's doing very exciting stuff. And she's been a visiting professor at the Institute of Creative Technologies at USC and at the Catholic University in Chile. And today she's going to talk to us about applying a human touch to personalized digital learning. Please join me in welcoming Amy Ogan.
Hi everybody, thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon. So, as Jeff said, I'll be talking today about making learning environments personalized and also interpersonal. If I can get my slides to work. There we go. All right, so, well, the good news is that globally, more and more students are enrolling in primary education. The downside is that this has left us with classrooms with soaring numbers of students, but the same number of teachers. Now, this, as you can see from this chart, is particularly a problem in places like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, and I actually do a lot of work in those places, which I'd be happy to tell you about if we have time or in discussions later, but that's not the focus of my talk today. Today, we're going to be looking at this problem of personalized learning. So while we have more and more students in our classrooms, we know from prior research in education that sitting in a conventional classroom with one teacher for many students, even if it's only 30 students in the classroom, leads to far less learning than when students receive one-on-one tutoring. And this may come as no surprise to you. A good tutor can personalize the interaction by listening to, knowing, and caring about each student. They can support the whole teaching experience. And I'm sure everybody here can think back, or maybe you have one sitting in the room right now, a great teacher who really inspired you, who drove you to push harder and to think deeper, and inspired you to new levels of achievement. And so while it would be amazing for each of us to have a personal tutor who was able to do this, this clearly isn't a scalable solution to the problem of quality education around the globe. So, to help overcome this problem, there's been a push to introduce these same benefits of personalization into digital learning environments. Also, other great things about digital learning environments, we can highly control and test our theories of learning, and sometimes we can even offer advantages over and above human tutoring. So the Department of Education has presented Congress with a plan for future learning technologies, and the centerpiece of this plan is personalization. So I've distilled this into the following features. That is individualization, or adjusting the pace of learning; differentiation, adjusting the approach that you take to learning; connecting to learners' interests and experiences outside of the learning environment; and also involving all the dimensions of the learner, not just the cognitive, but the social and the emotive as well. All right, so first I'm going to give you a little bit of background on individualization. So there are already successful educational technologies that meet this individualization challenge. And one class of such systems has been built on top of a cognitive architecture that you may have heard of called ACT-R. And so I've had a discussion with some of you earlier today about whether that's the right approach or not. Happy to keep talking about that. But this technology was built on top of this architecture created by John Anderson at CMU. And it's taken off from there to present instruction as a series of problems broken down into steps. And so one crucial distinction of the individualization is first through what Van Laine calls the inner loop. This is a process that executes every time that a student attempts a step. And the inner loop's job is to analyze the student's responses to each step and then generate the next step. And at this point, it also does Bayesian knowledge tracing to track exactly what the learner knows and can do in order to guide the feedback that it's providing. All right, so if I give you a quick example of what that looks like, here's an individualized learning system from an online chemistry course. And if I attempt a problem here, I've got a correct answer. The inner loop executes. A production rule system analyzes my response compared to how an expert might attempt the problem, and it'll turn the step green to show that I'm correct. But when the inner loop finds that I make a mistake, it's able to provide feedback that references the current context of the problem solution and also references what the system knows about my own prior knowledge. And if I'm really stuck, the program can also generate hints for how to make the next step in the problem. However, what makes this approach really individualized is the outer loop. And this outer loop executes once per problem. Its jobs are to organize problems and select the most appropriate problem for each student to tackle next in order to maximize the learning benefits. And this is where the knowledge tracing really comes into play. So the outer loop applies in the context of a full curriculum, and this is where it can individualize and optimize the path that each student takes through the curriculum. So this two-leveled approach, the inner and outer loop, to individualization has been shown to lead to significant learning gains in many studies in classrooms here in the US. But while this sets a high bar, it doesn't yet tackle all of the other aspects of personalization that address the whole learner and the context in which they exist. And so that's where my interests lie, and so I'm going to show you a few of my projects today that investigate related questions to how we address these, particularly with respect to how we make these systems interpersonal. All right, and so I thought I'd just take a second and talk about my department at Carnegie Mellon, which is the Human-Computer Interaction Institute. So in our department, we tend to take a three-part approach to research. Often the first step is to do system development based on an empirical investigation of whether it's a learner or a user with disabilities or a pilot who's looking to control a system. We run an empirical investigation of how they do that, and then we build a system that enables support for that individual in that context. And then from the system development, we're actually able to do a further investigation of how that system supports the individual and then brings us back to building theory about how and when such support is necessary and appropriate. And then we can use this theory building to draw us back into the development of a new and improved system that lets us, again, evaluate and further develop our theory. So I'm going to tell you first about one project in this area in which we investigated social interaction in the context of computer-mediated peer tutoring. And so we use, in this case, authentic human data to inform the design of future systems by building theories of human-computer interaction. And so this is an important step for us, is to investigate how humans working together interact in a system before we introduce a technical component to that system. All right, so if you think back to our chemistry tutor example, I told you that it can provide feedback that references the current context of the problem. And importantly, this feedback is modeled after what a human tutor might say in this circumstance. So often they've investigated expert adult human tutors and created some feedback, some dialogue that would provide this feedback. And if we place this in the context of our loop structure, instead of thinking of instruction solely as a problem with a series of steps, we can also think of it as a conversational interaction with a series of turns. And so what I believe is that we should think of these existing systems as having something akin to a social inner loop in addition to the problem-solving loop, that's responsible for the generation of socially appropriate material for each turn in an interaction. All right, so now in this chemistry example, systems with such a social inner loop tend to employ almost exclusively a model of politeness strategies. And they base this on Brown and Levinson's theory, which modifies the problem statement down here, the hints up there, even the wording of the problem to include very polite wording. And if you think about how humans have historically envisioned artificial agents, often we endow them with very polite personalities. So you can think back to many of your favorite agents that exist in our movies or other places. But, so this comes from human tutoring, it comes from the way we've envisioned these agents previously. But my question was whether this actually makes sense when we're talking about peer tutoring, peers learning together. Because if you've ever watched kids interact with their friends, politeness is not the first thing that comes to mind. And there's a lot of literature that would back this up. In fact, if you look at Brown and Levinson's theory itself, it predicts the decline of politeness as a relationship grows stronger. This is not actual data. This suggests that if a personalized learning system is truly going to make a long-term connection with the learner, it needs to be adaptive in its social strategies. All right, so now I'm proposing that we add a social outer loop to our model, which selects the best social strategies over time. And then these two loops can talk through a structure called a student model, which will now need to be augmented with a social understanding of the student. So if we have a social outer loop and a student model that persists beyond a single interaction or a single problem in the tutor, then we can start to think about long-term social strategies. And because we expect to put these systems in our classrooms for the long term, we think that this has a lot of potential for driving the way that systems think about interacting with their students. All right, so to develop these questions, I'm investigating 3 core questions. 1, what does the social inner loop look like in the context of peer tutoring? 2, how does that interaction actually affect learning? And finally, how do social strategies evolve over time? All right, so we first take a look at what strategies might be used in a social inner loop during peer tutoring. And so in some of these, I've skipped over some of the details of the studies, but we can dig into any of that if you guys are interested. So we first took a look at some existing data from a computer-mediated tutoring context. So 2 kids who were working at computers on opposite sides of the room, and they were chatting through this interface, where the tutor could see the 2T's work and correct it, and they could also chat where they were able to discuss the problems with their tutor. They could give hints and feedback themselves. And so students took turns tutoring one another in these interactions. All right, and as I noted before, we had groups of friends and groups of strangers who engaged in this peer tutoring paradigm. Mostly friends, and then about 6 dyads that we paired up together who didn't know each other before they came in. So we focus on about 5,400 utterances of peer tutors, first who were already friends with one another when they came into this interaction. And if you note, all of the things that you will see here are real quotes from what actual students said. This is their real data. All right, so in order to approach an understanding of what social interaction looked like in this context, we first coded all of the data for the set of linguistic devices that are derived from prior literature on social interaction. And so we can note that tutors and 2Ts use these devices quite differently. So the 2Ts tended to do things like be condescending, obviously add now, duh, or complaining about their partner. You're making no sense, dude. On the other hand, the tutors used things like enforcers. So they were responsible for driving the interaction forward. So the tutor might say, pay attention, now divide. We also happen to look at things that just occur in chat, like obviously you can do emoticons or the inclusion of extra letters, etc. And so from these linguistic devices, we derived a set of conversational strategies from a principal components analysis and looked at the ways in which tutors and tutees use these different strategies to move the interaction forward. And so the names that we gave the components were playfulness, so things that were engaged to lighten the mood or mitigate negativity, face threat, bidding for attention, and adding emphasis. All right, and what we found was that there was a significant difference in how our tutors and our tutees used these sets of conversational strategies. So for example, the tutor was primarily responsible for introducing playfulness and emphasis into the conversation, so they'd say things like, "Yay, you did it!" Whereas the tutee was primarily responsible for the impoliteness that got introduced in the conversation through face threat and bids for attention. So for example, the tutee might say, "I need help, tutor," and the tutor says, "What do you do next?" So far that sounds very much like an adult human tutoring interaction until you get to the next part where the kid says, "The computer told me, ask why you got it wrong. Answer, you're stupid." And the tutor, again, is responsible for bringing us back to task. He says, "Dude, stop, add VT to both sides." So they're engaged in this battle for how and when they're going to move forward. All right, so that gives us some of the strategies that we might begin to introduce into our inner social loop. But what we actually want to know is how these social interaction strategies impact learning. Because if they're not going to support learning, then we may not want to include them in our systems. All right, so specifically I'm going to show you how the tutees' strategies impacted the tutor's learning. And that will come clear in a minute when I show you the way in which we built our next system. All right, and so we ran a stepwise regression to look at how these impacted learning gains. And we can put this on sort of two axes of positivity to no positivity and face threat to no face threat. And what I found was that two factors were most significant in this analysis. All right, these two here. All right, so we'll look at so this is what the regression showed us. But if we put that into practice in this graph, what we see is that many things supported the interaction. So positivity in the positivity with face threat supported learning in the interaction. So that would be things like, "Ha, nice, use the hint, silly, and tell me what it says." So that's being, you can hear this playful face threat in this interaction. The child is calling his partner silly, but sort of mitigating that by including some laughter and obviously drawing on their relationship in order to make this more playful than face threatening. These other aspects here also, even just face threat, "Thanks for your help," not "you were so late," supported learning, and so did this task-based dialogue, things like, "Okay, adding the MB to that side now." The only thing that we found that did not actually support learning were these supportive statements like, "Dustin, that was a phenomenal job tutoring me." Actually did nothing when correlated with learning outcomes from this interaction. So that's pretty interesting. It may be that students were actually introducing this into the conversation when it was not actually true. Maybe Dustin was not doing a great job tutoring him, and instead this student should have been pushing him harder on how to actually help him solve this problem. So one thing we found here is that politeness is not always supportive of learning, which would contradict the way that systems are developed when we think about expert human tutors. All right, so we've seen some additional conversational strategies that might be generated by the social inner loop, and we've seen how they may or may not support learning. And then third, we want to investigate how these social strategies change in the outer loop as we're engaging in peer tutoring over time. And so we investigated this question by first getting a glimpse by looking at the data that was excluded from the first analyses. So we're looking at the strangers, participants who are representative of a group that has a lower relationship strength than the friends do. Now remember, this was only 6 dyads compared to 54 who were friends, so this is just a very exploratory first look at what happens here. But what we found, first of all, was, as many other researchers have found, that friends learn more when they are learning together. And so for me, this justifies our desire to build systems that interact in similar ways that engage students in a positive, friendly relationship. So friends learned more. And then we ran our conversational strategies through the same regression and found that in this case, face threat was actually a strong negative predictor of learning for these groups. So in the rare instances, this did not happen very often, but the rare instances when strangers used face threat, it tended to look like this. Well, why are you the tutor then? You might imagine coming from a stranger. That wouldn't engage you in a very friendly interaction. So they're sort of directly confrontational. And so without having that basis of friendship to draw on that can allow your relationship to recover and to thrive under such duress, this type of talk was associated with much less learning for the tutor. You might ask about these playful face-threatening responses, but that's a question mark because there was not a single instance of this happening with our stranger dyads in this study. So we don't actually know whether that's supportive or whether it will never happen. All right, so this was the data from this computer-mediated study over chat. We've additionally looked at a longitudinal study in which we had kids in the lab face-to-face with one another working on a problem set in front of them. And so from this, we've got lots of video and audio recordings. We look at verbal and nonverbal features of their interaction, and we're able to look at it over time. But if I just jump into some of the results, we've got results first on off-task talk. So what we found here was that friends talk more than strangers do, and they include a lot more off-task talk than strangers. So they might be telling them to add VT to both sides, and then they ask them about how their swim meet went the day before. But importantly, we found that there was no difference in on-task talk, so they just talked more, and there was no difference in the number of problems solved. So even though the kids were engaging in all sorts of social chit-chat, they were able to move forward at the same pace as the strangers. We also looked at cognitive and metacognitive strategy use and found that friend tutors ask more questions, while stranger tutors do more knowledge telling. The stranger tutors also use more positive feedback. So in essence, what was happening was that the stranger tutors were just walking their tutees through the problem. They were basically telling them how to solve it. Whereas the friend tutors were using a more Socratic strategy. They were asking them, what's the next step? How do you do this? And getting the tutees to reflect. Interestingly, the friend tutors also trended towards more metacognitive statements. So they'd pause to ask if the tutee knew whether they knew the answer to a problem or not, for example. Yes?
Was there an age difference between the friends and strangers?
Nope, they were all middle school students, so the age was about 12 to 14, and there was no significant difference in age between the friends and the strangers. In addition, I don't know if I mentioned this, we paired them up in same gender pairs, and we matched them on prior knowledge. All right, We also looked, in this case, at their delivery style and found that friends, as you might expect, were more direct, and that friend tutors gave more direct feedback. So meaning they didn't couch any of their feedback with hedges or any of the other features of indirect delivery style. All right, so this work has shown us that the outer loop can adapt the path towards learning by changing the interaction strategies based on an assessment of relationship strength. But also, we need to look at the role. So we need to look at whether you're a tutor or you're a tutee and understand the role that you're playing in the interaction before we can design systems that actually either mimic or are supportive of real human-human interaction. All right, so while this investigation addressed interactions between students, these answers now take us towards the next step. How do students actually interact with a personalized learning system? So when we take the second human out of the equation. And so in particular, in my work, I like to consider systems that can express social functionality in a more sophisticated way. So we're often looking at things like embodied conversational agents, or an agent with an embodied physical appearance that can participate in some form of dialogue with the learner. All right, so that's the focus of another one of my projects here. So in this system, you'll see the agent doesn't look quite so realistic as in that last picture I showed. Here we sort of started out with a cartoon-looking agent named Joe. And what this system is an educational system that is designed to be a teachable agent. Now this is why I was looking previously at how 2T strategies impacted the tutor, because here instead of having the child sit down and be tutored by the system, we're actually having the child sit down and teach the system how to solve literal equations. And one of the reasons we do this is because we know the learning by teaching effect is so strong. You guys have probably heard of this. If you have to learn something, teach it, and you will really deeply learn it. And so this is a class of systems that's set up to do just that. Under the hood, the system learns as the student inputs new answers into it, and the system can start to make guesses using inductive logic to actually start being able to solve these problems independently. All right, so several of these systems have been built. This one was built by a gentleman who was at Carnegie Mellon and is now at Texas A&M, the Noboru Matsuda. All right, so in the teaching interface, students, let's see, at the top, they enter a literal algebraic equation that they would like their teachable agent to work on. Here the teachable agent is named Joe. The agent uses inductive logic to solve the problem, but at points it needs the tutor's help. So it asks questions when it needs more support. So when Joe gets stuck, the human tutor can demonstrate the correct step for him in the interface. And so here's one of the very limited social signs that Joe gives, indicating that he's confused and needs help. All right, so Joe continues working on the problem, he asks questions, and the student can chat to him in the interface. So I think this is a picture of just a yes or no button, but the student can also type in answers to the questions, and the system does some processing on the language. And then there are a few other social signals, like Joe can show that he's happy, that he's finished a problem and moves on, but that's about it. All right, so in this study we brought students into the lab for 2 sessions. So they take a pre-test and a post-test, and in between they interact with the system on both days. All right, so they tutor the agent until it's able to pass a quiz on the literal equations topic. All right, so if I jump just straight into the results, what we found was that just as with the human friends, students who teased Joe learned more from the interaction. So this sort of playful face threat when students who expressed that in their interactions learned more. In addition, I found that talking about Joe was associated with less learning. So that is, students who engaged in an actual conversation with Joe, talking directly to him, learned more than students who talked about him or sort of engaged in just a narrative about what they were doing. And this we looked at through investigating inclusive pronouns. And to me, what's super interesting here is that if you pull out the dialogue that students had with their agent, it looked remarkably like the dialogue that the human friends had with one another. So you can look at some of the same linguistic devices. Oh God, you failed, Joe, oh God. Or challenge, Joe says, I think the problem's solved. Our participant says, really? Well, I don't. And so we had raters look at these dialogue snippets and look at a set from the human tutors tutoring one another, and they can't tell the difference. All right, so our first assumption that gets broken here is that impoliteness is actually the same thing as agent abuse. So previous work that has looked at how people interacted with agents has found that oftentimes humans get into these combative conversations with agents. That may not always be a problem in our learning environment. And we can say this in part because we can link it up to what's actually happening as human children talk with one another. But we may need to understand exactly when this sort of disruptive talk has benefits or does not have benefits. All right, and so if we take that data, but we return back to thinking about the outer loop, how this interaction should change over time, and remembering that decline in positivity as relationship strength increases, we can compare students' dialogue patterns from day 1 to day 2 of the intervention. And so what I found was that they were congruent to this hypothesis, that positive social comments decreased over time, and I found that negative comments increased significantly over time. So those examples that I showed you just a slide or two ago barely happened on day 1 and happened significantly more on day 2. And what I take from this is that the agents became more comfortable with, or the students became more comfortable with the agent over time from day 1 to day 2. And what I think is really interesting here is that this change in interaction happened extremely quickly. So if we look at our humans tutoring one another over a 6-week longitudinal session, you only start to see these sorts of things going on by week 5 or week 6, or maybe never even happening between strangers. Whereas here you get these kids in 2 interactions with an agent, and they've already made this switch. So this is one of those places where perhaps instead of attempting to mimic real human-human interaction, we need to account for the differences in how students interact with computers and digital agents. Okay, so we've moved from 2 students interacting to a student and an agent, but this is still a limited investigation. As I told you, the students could talk to Joe, but it was kind of a one-way street. He didn't really produce many social signals back, right? So very quickly, I'll look at what happens when an agent can be social in return. All right, so this is a very different project, but this is an agent that I developed with a model of social instructional dialogue. And in this project, I was working in a very different paradigm. The environment for this work is called Bilat. I was working with the folks at USC on this project. And in it, the learner takes the role of an American official in Iraq. And this official must accomplish peacekeeping and rebuilding missions. Right? So the goal is to do peaceful intercultural exchange and perhaps even negotiation. And so the character that you see here on the right is named Fareed. He's an Iraqi police officer. And to engage in this environment, you do a menu-based selection of dialogue. The agent responds with culturally appropriate gestures, gaze, etc. A lot of work went into developing sort of the movements and the dialogue that's produced by these virtual agents. All right. So in order to study these questions, I designed a new agent for the interaction called Zahora. And she was an Iraqi interpreter who gave information about the Iraqi culture before you went into any of these negotiation scenarios. So her instructional content is based around a set of mini dialogues that focus on Iraqi perspectives, and she takes advantage of the same models of gesture, gaze, and speech, etc. from the other agents in this environment. All right, but where she differs is her dialogue. So we created her dialogue in principal ways that hypothesized links between some additional conversational strategies and their expected effects on interpersonal outcomes. And so we call this social instructional dialogue, or SID. And the potential interloop strategies that we were investigating here were increasing self-disclosure, positive affirmation, and an unrolling narrative. So each of these strategies has parameters that are built into the system, and each utterance within a branching structure gets a value for each of these parameters, and we adjusted those parameters based on some empirical evidence through workshops using the system. All right, so this is in comparison to a task informational dialogue that had the same learning objectives, the same number of dialogue turns and words, but took out sort of all of this social content that we were evaluating. We called this TID. All right, so in this study, we compared 3 conditions. Students using a system that had the SID agent, the system that had the TID agent, and then we compared to a control that was only reading the same content from a textbook. So that was the textbook from which the whole system, the dialogue for all of the system was built. All right, and so what did we find from students engaging with the system? First of all, when they engaged with the social system, the SID system, it changed the way that they actually played the game. So first of all, they took significantly fewer meetings to achieve their task goals. So this is a measure of how effective of a negotiator you are. They also, interestingly, took a fewer number of total actions, and yet they took the same amount of time to play the game. So to me, this indicates that they were reflecting more on each action before they took it. And in fact, this is also reflected in the fact that they took fewer unique actions than students who were using the TID agent. For example, they avoided doing things like punching Fareed in the face or other interactions that clearly have a negative consequence. They were actually deeply considering these interactions and choosing not to take them. And they focused less on the business interactions and the same amount on the social interactions, which for us, again, was very important because one of the main learning goals in this learning environment is to make sure that social relationships are tended to. All right, and so that's how they played the game. What we actually found about their interaction with the agent Zahora was that they felt much more like they shared a perspective with Zahora when she had the social instructional dialogue based model. They felt much more entitativity with this agent, or a feeling of being on the same team and working together. And they felt significantly more like they trusted this agent. And so there's a lot of really interesting qualitative data here, but just quickly, we found that when we asked whether this agent was useful or not to students who had the task-based dialogue, we heard things like this. She was kind of helpful, but not as much as the packets of information that we got. So they basically treated this agent the same as reading a set of material about the same content. Whereas students with the social dialogue told us things like, being able to interact socially with Zahora in the beginning, it really made you feel more trusting of the other characters in the game. Now, we remember Zahora was the only character in the game that used this social dialogue model, But what we found was that this person's comments were actually reflected in their interactions across all of our participants. So we found that these social effects that I talked about, things like entitativity and trust, were stronger with the other agents as well, even when they did not contain this dialogue. And in particular, you can see, I think this one is really interesting. So they felt like they were working more on a team with Hassan, and they trusted Hassan more in the social condition than in the task-based condition, even though overall everybody still didn't feel like they trusted Hassan. And this is great because Hassan is a terrible character. He's a character that nobody wants to interact with. He's mean, he's tough, and he's really hard to get through. But what we see here is that with the social dialogue that supports players getting into the system, getting immersed, feeling like they're socially engaged with the system, they may be able to persist with these characters longer and actually engage more deeply with them, even when they don't like them. Yes?
Do you think Hassan maybe united the students by creating a common identity for them?
Yeah, good question. Everybody hated Hassan, so I think it would be interesting to have them engage back with the social character after they engage with the Hassan and see if we could build that teamwork in the environment. Okay, so what we've learned from this are that interactions in such environments are not isolated. Same as in a classroom, the way that you interact with somebody in your class affects the rest of your interaction with the teacher, with your other peers, etc. And the same thing happens for our agents. And of course, we found some learning outcomes too. Both the task and the social condition achieved more objectives than the control condition, but only the social condition made fewer social errors in the system than the control condition. Okay, so I've just shared with you several of my projects that look at this dynamic control for interpersonal learning systems. But there's a lot of work to be done here still. So for example, we need to understand not just what constitutes this relationship in a learning environment, but how a system can progress through stages as it starts off a stranger on day one and moves towards being perhaps a known and loved companion. So for example, the outer loop might need to actually do a probe in between each interaction with a new strategy to determine whether learners are responsive to taking the next step. We don't yet know, even if you could determine this with in human-human studies, we don't yet know to what extent this transfers to human-computer studies. We'll also need to understand what features of the learner and the context are important to track in the student model. And so my work has shown that the role that the student takes in an interaction is really important. The strength of the relationship that they have with their partner is really important, but there's probably other features as well, such as how successful they were previously in interacting with this agent that might have a strong influence on their future interactions. Okay, so overall, my work takes this holistic view towards developing personalized and interpersonal learning systems by connecting to learners' experiences and involving the social and affective dimensions of the learner. And my goals are to create systems that are personalized and interpersonal, but also work within the ecosystem of the classroom. So I think we might be short on time. I mentioned that I've done a lot of this work globally. If you guys are interested, during the question time, I can talk a little bit about that work as well.
We have at least 10 more minutes.
Yeah, okay, awesome, great.
Yeah.
So I will keep going.
All right.
Okay, cool. So that was the work that I've done in looking at interpersonal learning engagements, and all of that work was done in American classrooms and with American students. Another benefit of technology is that we can take the technology and we can just parachute it all over the world, right? We can just sort of send tablets to Ghana, or we can mail a CD to Thailand or whatever. Actually, though, my work shows that it's not quite as easy as that. All right, so turns out that cultural factors in the classroom have a big impact on the success of your technology, and it's not quite this easy. All right, so for example, we took an individualized learning system similar to the one I showed you before, but now only one kid interacting with that one computer. And we've done studies with it in, actually, now I think we're at 2 more sites around the world. And obviously this work is done with a lot of collaborators. So whenever I go do this work, I engage in long-term collaborations, and I go do field studies for a couple months at a time to explore how these systems actually function in the classroom in a variety of sites. So for example, this is the site we were working at in Mexico. And of course there are technology differences, so you can see here they had these tiny telnet, or like 1 laptop per child size of computers. This is my site in Costa Rica. So these students are far more tech savvy. You can see they would not put their cell phones down. Even the teachers were texting in the middle of class. And that's just in comparison. Now you can see what an American classroom actually looks like, with most of the kids sort of lined up at these desks and working individually on their laptops. They were pretty used to having computers be part of their learning in the classroom. All right, and so let's see. One of the things that we find before you go, obviously, is that you need to do some translation of the content. But it turns out it's not just translation. So, if you're working in Brazil, most of those students have no idea what a lemonade stand is, which was the root of several of our problems in this math system. And they don't have well, first of all, they don't have a 0 degree and a 90-degree day because they work in Celsius. And secondly, it never gets that cold. So, this is a problem that could be quite difficult to understand. It adds a lot of cognitive load on top of just doing the math. And so we have to work a lot on localization and not just translation. So in that last case, I think we changed it to how many coconuts did you sell on the beach, depending on the amount of precipitation happening that day. All right, and so from these studies, we end up getting lots and lots of data, pre and post tests, system logs, all sorts of other things, interviews, field notes. I'm going to skip through some of this stuff, but okay, so one of the things that we do is looking at building models that can help support the underlying architectures of the system. And one of the important models that we're working on right now is help seeking, understanding how and when students seek help from the system so that we can better provide that help at the right time when students need it. And so what we found was that our data from Latin America looked absolutely nothing like the data from the United States. The models built on American data couldn't predict what was happening in help seeking in Latin America, and the reverse happened as well. So of course it's really important that you're actually in the classroom to figure out what's happening. And so what we saw here was that, for example, students frequently working together. So here you see an example where the student in the center, this is my site in Chile, starts working on a problem, and the 2 kids beside him start thinking that's interesting. They turn and check it out, and then start actually typing on the computer for him. All right, or these 3 kids decided they were going to work together in the back of the class, but by the end of the class period, 3 more people had joined them, and they were all working on the same system. And in fact, what we're finding is that the collaborative behavior is far more significant in the, in Chile than in any of my other sites. So this is Chile, where 14% of their behaviors were collaborative, whereas in the US it was 4 to 7%, and the Philippines about 9%. So about 2 to 3 times the collaborative behaviors we're seeing in my Latin American sites. So you can actually see some more of this here. The girl's actually leaning over and typing on the other, on her neighbor's computer. And in fact, we found the same thing happened here, that far more of the time, they're actually controlling their partner's materials. Compared to, nobody has even looked at this in the United States because it pretty much just doesn't happen. So about 18% of the on-task collaborative behavior in the lab was from a partner's machine. So you can imagine what might happen to your model of help seeking when a vast amount of your help seeking is actually happening outside of the system, as opposed to in our classrooms in the US, where the help they're getting is by clicking on the hints or the feedback in order to get support from the very system itself. So that's one of the things that we're looking at in some of our sites in Latin America, and there we're designing for social system use. So things like low-cost sensing for context. So can you tell who's actually working on the system at any particular time? Can we do collaborative knowledge tracing? So not just tracing any one individual's data, but can we figure out who knows what and when, and can we use that to do better help giving, and perhaps to even provide adaptive scaffolding so that we know who should be working together. Can we send child 1 over to child 5 because they know the answer and they might be able to help that student out, rather than putting unproductive pairs together, for example. Let's see if I've got any. Oh, nope. All right, so all right, so that's my work in Latin America. We're also looking at what's going on in our classrooms in the Philippines, which is another really interesting site where the language of instruction in the classroom is English, but English is often the second or third language that these children speak. And so we're finding really interesting differences in the way they engage with the system. So we ran that same teachable agent system with Joe in the Philippines. And what we found was that instead of teasing the agent to its face, the students were code switching into their home language before they engaged in any of the teasing behaviors. So that was one aspect of the interaction. They were engaging in these playful behaviors in a language they knew the system didn't understand. But the second thing they were doing was code switching into their home language to report that they didn't know the answer. So they weren't willing to tell the system that they didn't know in English. Instead, they were, we think, working on face management by switching into a language the system didn't understand in order to not have to demonstrate their lack of knowledge. So we're working on some interesting questions there in the Philippines. And then finally, let's see. In this summer I spent in Tanzania looking at a context where I don't normally go, which is a place where electricity isn't constant. It's a low resource environment. And so there's a lot of questions around how and when technology actually might be useful in such an environment. There's a big push for investment in technology in such regions, but very little understanding of how and when it actually works or whether it should be put in place at all. And so we're still in the middle of analyzing this enormous amount of data that we've got from our Tanzania interactions, but we found that it definitely is not going to be as easy as some of the foundations think it will be to just drop these tablets off and leave them with these children. A lot of difficulty in figuring out how to use the systems, but once they got in and they had support from a teacher or another adult who had some familiarity with the technology, they were incredibly engaged, and we think there is a lot of potential for students who actually are able to interact deeply with the content. All right, so I think we're probably into the question period now, but happy to answer questions on any of those projects if you're interested. as well as the work on rapport and interpersonal learning systems.